Okay, here we are.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we are ready of this. We can start with this. Well, good morning. I'm Professor Spadina. My name is Andre Cosillo. I'm member of the Peruvian Society of Labor and Social Security Law. On behalf of the president of the society, we want to say thank you for granting us this interview. You and Professor Herschel Olfen are the coordinators of the research group for migrant workers for the 23 World Congress of the International Society of Labor Law and Security Law. For me, it's my pleasure to have this interview with you. Well, good morning and good afternoon in Croatia.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cosillo. It is a great pleasure to be part of International Congress of Labor and Social Law. And also it was a great pleasure to coordinate together with my colleague, Professor Helga Spadina, to coordinate this research group on migrant workers.
Thank you. Well, this is a process in the migration. It's a process, a complex phenomenon. And in 2020, the International Organization for Migration states that the number of international migrants is estimated to be almost 232 million globally, with nearly 2/3 being labor migrants. In that sense, how the research group describes the phenomenon of labor migration in this century?
It's an extremely complex phenomenon which is involving not only 272 migrants globally, but it involves over 800 million people worldwide who basically depend on remittances from labor migration. In this context, we have also to bear in mind that labor migration is increasingly concentrated in destination high-income countries with ongoing labor shortages, with very high demand in certain sectors and occupations, and relatively liberal immigration policies. 2/3 of world's migrants live in North America, Western and Eastern Europe, and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries in the Persian Gulf. So in that context, we have to take into consideration all the specific aspects of labor migration. In this report we prepared for the World Congress, we developed some proposals for setting up improved, first of all, legislation framework regarding high-skilled migrants and the low-skilled migrants. The report is divided into these two main groups. On one hand, regarding high-skilled migrants, we have a global race for talent. We have a very significant competitiveness of destination countries. And on the other hand, we have very high demand also for low-skilled migrant work. And in that sense, we noticed throughout our research and throughout our work, there is a great need to improve labor and social rights of temporary migrants who are mainly in this lower skill group of migrant workers. Migration policies need to be revisited because now we need to take advantage of the labor mobility prior to COVID, definitely, and also we need to create inclusive, efficient, integrated labor markets with high protection of labor and social rights.
Yeah, it's regularly that in terms of, in this process of migration, there are differences between national and migrant workers. You know, what are the measures applied by certain countries involved in the research in terms of wage gaps between nationals and migrant workers, what are the findings of the research group about this topic?
It is difficult to answer that question because the wage gap and the education gap are two aspects of labor migration which are quite prominent in all the research and in all the available data. Labor migrants are, at least in the area of the European Union, for which we have the most recent statistical breakdown, labor migrants are have a higher education attainment than the national labor force, but they very often, because of difficulties with certification, because of difficulties with qualification recognition and other administrative difficulties, they're very often working in sectors of work which are below their education attainment. When we have such a situation, then we also have to look into the other side of the problem, which is this wage gap which you mentioned. And this wage gap is particularly visible in when we speak about certain sectors of employment. They're also particularly visible when we compare female migrant workers with male migrant workers, where we have traditional, unfortunately, traditional wage gap. So with migrant workers, available data shows us very clearly that insufficient measures were taken so far. Our report actually mentions certain examples of how countries are trying to reduce this wage gap, but unfortunately, this is still one of the issues which we still have to work on, and we have to try to resolve this wage gap, because if we want to provide equality of rights between migrant workers and the national labor force, if we want to make labor migration more attractive, if we want to increase competitiveness in the international labor market, then we have to make sure that migrant workers earn as much as national workers in the same jobs, in the same sectors.
Yeah, this is the, for example, the low skilled migrant workers and high skilled migrant workers. I don't know, for example, the expats workers are in some companies have, for example, higher gaps, wages differently that the local employees. This is the same in the, for example, high skilled migrant workers and low skilled migrant workers. Where are the main findings of in this difference?
Our findings are that we have a higher wage gap when it comes to lower skilled migrant workers, or they don't need to be lower skilled, but they're working in a lower skilled sectors. As I said, they can have a higher education which is not recognized, and then they are employed in a sector which is considered to require a lower skill education. And when we speak about this, then we have to also bear in mind that we have also another problem, which is that migrant workers are often recruited internationally through different recruitment agencies, and they've been told that, for example, their gross salary will be their net salary. So they receive conflicting and not always correct information about their wages. So once when they come to destination countries, they realize there is quite a significant difference in their salaries, and they realize that their salaries at the end of the month are lower than the salaries of their local colleagues, which is something that all the countries should actually actively work on to try to reduce this gap. Because if we don't work on a reduction of this gap, then labor migrants will choose different destination countries, and they will go to other places, and we'll have labor shortages in sectors which already have labor shortages, like, for example, healthcare sector, which is now very important. Then agricultural work, which is extremely important because of all the issues surrounding the COVID problems with mobility, then seasonal work, then tourism. These are all key sectors in which we cannot really afford to discriminate labor workers. We should never discriminate migrant workers, because they should have equality in wages like domestic workers.
Okay. Also, I'm curious about this. This is in the findings in gender terms between females and male workers. Are particular characteristics in gender terms in these different salaries between migrant workers and nationals?
Yes, we do have higher number of global migrant workers. Higher proportion of them are men, because in certain countries it is more traditional that men would migrate for work than women. But when it comes to the wage gaps, then our report clearly shows that women migrant workers face so-called double wage penalty, both as a migrant and as a women. And the pay gap between men nationals and migrant women is estimated to be as high as 20.9%, which is much higher than the aggregated gender pay gap in high-income countries, according to the available information of International Labour Organization. Also, pay gap between migrant care workers and non-migrant care workers, where we have majority of women working, because women tend to work in migrant work, they tend to work more in care services. That pay gap is about 90.6% compared to aggregated migrant pay gap of 12.6%. So numbers speak very clearly that women, female migrants are discriminated against when it comes to the equality of wages.
Okay. Well, we are in times of COVID-19. You know that a lot of countries has taken measures regarding the lockdowns or close their borders and a lot of this. How the COVID-19 have impact on labor migration? What are the main findings of the research group about this?
COVID had a tremendous impact on mobility in general. So it had also tremendous impact on migrant workers. They were not able to leave the countries of employment, to return home. They were also not able to receive full medical coverage in the case they needed health care services. They also were unable to socially distance at the workplaces. They were not able to socially distance at the often very crowded accommodation for a lower skilled migrants, especially seasonal migrants, especially these temporary migrants. Also, they were more often, according to available data, they were more often in a group of essential workers, meaning they were not able to work remotely. And this affected their exposure to virus. We have reports indicating that migrants were in a much higher risk of infecting COVID than other groups of workers. Also, they were suffering from labor exploitation issues, because in the cases of sudden closures of the businesses, migrant workers were among the first one to be laid off, to be dismissed. And unfortunately, we had quite a lot of labor exploitation, where employers were not paying salaries to migrant workers upon closure. Then we also have another problem, which is that migrant workers were not able to benefit from wage subsidies by the governments. And this is also another issue which made us aware that migrant workers are actually excluded from unemployment, social protection in some countries. There were countries, and we are writing about them in our report. We are mentioning them. There are countries which actually included migrant workers into unemployment social protection, but unfortunately, we also have other examples. Also, for migrant workers, this reintroduction of visas and also restrictions to labor market entry, they were not able to enter countries unless they were in a group of essential workers, and we are mentioning examples of countries where migrant workers were in a category of essential workers, mainly for health care professionals, mainly for those working in transport, working in agriculture, working in certain care services for elderly. And there were certain exceptions in which they were fortunately able to get employment. But all in all, they were very much affected by COVID, and we all became aware of the tremendous contribution of migrants to our world. And we all became aware that without migrant workers, the world cannot really function properly. So COVID is also excellent opportunity to build new labor migration policies, to build more resilient system, and to ensure equality between migrant workers and nationals. And also we became very much aware that we need to pay equal attention to high-skill migration as much as to low-skill migration, because our world cannot function without any of those two groups. So I think this can be, and we are hoping that COVID will be actually a good starting point to bring forward some new policies and to facilitate movement and employment of migrant workers.
Yes. That are the lessons left by the COVID-19.
Yes, these are the lessons, exactly. And also, I think COVID showed us how much migrant workers are vulnerable and how much their families are also vulnerable, because in this pandemic, you have millions and millions of families who will remain without any source of income overnight. And this is a situation in which we really have to think how to extend social protection and how to extend inclusion of migrant workers in a cases of emergency like this was, health emergency. We have to think how to include them into all the subsidies and all the other sorts of assistance that countries were providing.
Yeah, for example, here in Peru, in the last year, we have we have an urgency to have personnel in sanitary services. Because of that, it was necessary to the government to put some measures in order to gain facilities to migrant workers who have license in their countries but not allowed to practice here. That's important to involve to that professionals to incorporate in the market, no? Because it's in terms of in this kind of crisis, we government have to implement measures in order to facilitate for that work.
Exactly, and we also have to be aware that currently in many high-income countries, we have thousands and thousands of migrant workers who are, for example, qualified doctors, qualified nurses. But as you said, they were not able to work during pandemic because of certification issues, because of recognition of qualification issues. And we, in a report, we are mentioning example of United States of America, where certain states actually were thinking and were trying to implement a system in which they were offering this qualification of recognitions, and that because These are the people who are already there. They speak languages which are very necessary to communicate vaccination issues, to communicate all COVID-related information and so on. So you have multilingual migrant workers who are, instead of working as doctors, they were working in supermarkets, or maybe they were doing something else, and then they are underutilized and they are overqualified for the work they're doing. So we have also some very good examples of how certain countries were trying to use this labor force, which is already there. On the other hand, we have excellent examples of countries which offered very rapid regularization process, because we have undocumented migrant workers, and certain countries realized that they have to do these rapid regularization programs, and they were quite useful in this situation, because undocumented migrants were unable also to move and to return to their countries. They were stranded. So regularization procedures allow them also to be able to travel again, and they also provided them opportunity to be able to legally enter the labor market. Then we also have excellent examples of countries, quite a lot, I would say, which offered extension of residence and work permits. And this was done also in a way which is using digital networks, using the digital applications. And this showed us that we can use this COVID crisis actually to digitalize the administrative aspects of labor migration, like, for example, licenses, visas, labor permits, residence permits, or we can even do some advanced things like qualification and language assessments. We can do job matching. So I think digitalization of labor migration is also one of the good lessons of COVID, because many countries, which is, for example, interesting for Eastern Europe, because prior to COVID, we never had digitalized services to the migrant workers. And,
same as Peru.
Exactly.
Same as Peru.
So suddenly we digitalized everything. We digitalized our education, we digitalized our health, and among everything, we digitalized also this kind of administrative support services to migrant workers. And this is going to be extremely important and extremely beneficial to make labor migration easier.
Yeah. Well, Professor Spadina, thank you for such a great, such an interesting interview. Well, finally, what are your expectations for this 23 World Congress? Hopefully virtual, but it's the challenge that COVID-19 put in together for us. But what are your expectations for this Congress virtual in Lima?
My expectation for the World Congress is that we will speak about very advanced issues of labor and social law. We will speak about future of labor and social law. We will accept that the world of labor has changed forever with COVID. And we will accept that now we have a digital work, we have remote work, which became also rather something very common, then something very exceptional, which was before. And we also have one interesting curiosity in a world of labor migration, and that is that several European countries and some countries also in Caribbean, as far as I can hear, introduced the so-called digital Nomads visas, which is the visa system for those who are working remotely and who can work from any country in the world. So also in a world of labor migration, we have substantial changes because of COVID and because of digitalization of the world of labor. So my expectations are that we will speak about digitalization of work and that we will jointly come to certain conclusions on how to improve labor and social rights in the circumstances which we have now, which are so different from 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And for our part, for migrant workers, I really hope that we will come up with the proposals for a system which is more fair, where we have equality of rights and where we have better, more resilient, more inclusive labor migration, always with new thing in mind, that even labor migration will be characterized by health screenings, will be probably dependent on vaccinations. So we have some new aspects to labor migration, but we cannot really live without migrant workers. So we have to make sure they're able to move according to the labor needs in different countries. And we have to also make sure there is no discrimination between migrant workers and between national workers.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I would ask you if you could invite to everyone to want to join to this World Congress, virtual World Congress in Lima, that's the 7th to 10th of September.
Yes, I would like to extend my cordial invitation to all interested in labor and social law issues. Even the format of our Congress, which is virtual, shows how much our world has changed, and you will have opportunity to listen to the world renewed experts speaking about labor and social issues. And also we will have altogether opportunity to put forward ideas on how to improve the world of labor and social rights.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Spadina, for this interview on behalf of the President of the Peruvian Society of Labor and Security Law. We are very grateful with your participation in this interview. And well, for me, it was a pleasure to have this interview with you.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to also Peruvian Association for organizing the Congress. I know that it would have been your great honor to host us in live, but maybe there will be another opportunity for some of the future congresses that we all return to.
Yeah, of course.